Hi, everyone, and welcome to the 10th webinar in NFF's recorded webinar series. My name is Ashley Franks, and I'm a senior associate in our advisory services practice. We are really grateful that you're taking time with us today to learn more about an important sector-wide challenge, which is how we think about the cost it takes to run a nonprofit successfully to achieve outcomes and how we fund those costs. And this is really core to the work that we do at NFF, where we help to seek community-centered organizations, especially those led by and serving people of color, to control the financial resources they need to achieve the goals they've set for themselves. And we do this work by making loans to nonprofits, by consulting with nonprofits and funders on the use and deployments of funds in the sector, and by working with partners on the ground to lift up our learnings with our clients and say, hey, nonprofits, hey, funders, here's something that's not working. Here's how we can make it better. And so our learning goals for today are to build shared awareness about the structurally inequitable systems in which we operate, to learn how to communicate the full cost of an organization, and to learn how to think about our organizations with a full cost mindset. And then, of course, we want to challenge assumptions about accountability, reasonable costs, power dynamics, and privilege to advance equity and results. And so with that, we're going to jump right into the content. By now, some of you watching this recording may have sat through at least a few of the webinars in this series. And if you have, you know that in one of our sessions, we talk about the flawed system in which we operate as a nonprofit sector and why it's so difficult for nonprofits to sustain and grow. And if you haven't sat through the session that details our operating context, I'll share with you what you already know as a player in the field in short. And that is that it is difficult for nonprofits to generate surpluses because we often operate money-losing businesses. And by that, I mean that nonprofits are providing services to folks who either can't pay at all or who can't pay the full cost of what it takes to deliver on our services. And so we end up relying on subsidies from third-party payers, funders, which is an entirely different business to run from our mission work. We know that and we feel that on the ground. And so knowing how hard it is for nonprofit organizations to achieve financial health, we know that aiming to break even is not enough. And so if you leave this webinar with one message today, we hope it is this, that nonprofits need profits. Nonprofits need surpluses. Nonprofit is a tax status, but it is not a business model. And that's because in addition to meeting day-to-day expenses, we need to meet three types of needs, which you'll see here up on the screen. The first is to meet our liquidity needs, which is making sure that our organizations have enough cash on hand to meet our bills day to day, week to week, month to month, to keep operations moving smoothly, even when the timing for cash coming in and cash going out does not match up. And then the second is adaptability, which means that we have flexible resources that will allow us to grow, change, make adjustments, and respond to changing community needs. I think you all out there know that COVID has really given us a universal example of how quickly we might need to adapt to changes and why dollars for adaptability are so important. And then finally, we need dollars for durability in different amounts, depending on our organization and our goals. And these are the resources that we think about really supporting our organizations in the very long term. And so we think about buildings living here. We think about investment reserves and things like that living here. Durability may be very important for organizations like, say, museums, universities, hospitals, housing organizations, right? Whereas durability might be less important for organizations who are focused on advocacy or whose programs require a lot of travel. Adaptability might be more important to these organizations. And so I'm now going to introduce the full cost framework, but before we dive into the various components of the framework, I want to say that when NFF uses the language full cost, we mean something very specific. We know that there are a lot of ways that this language is described in the field. Some people call it real cost, some people call it true cost, others call it total cost, and it's very easy to get conflated because often as a sector, when we use this language, we're talking about program versus overhead or direct costs versus indirect costs. And these are certainly very important things to talk about, right? It is very important that we demystify the segregated nature of these costs as we think about the fullness of our day-to-day needs. But at NFF, when we say full cost, we mean something much more. We mean something very specific. Because when we limit ourselves to talking about program versus overhead and direct versus indirect, it's as if we have a financial advisor who comes to us and says, hey guys, I have the perfect finance recipe to set your family up for success. And it goes like this. Take every paycheck you ever earn and spend it down to zero every month. Make sure that at the end of the year, every year, you have nothing left over in your bank account. That is financial success. I think you would laugh that financial advisor out of the room, right? Because of course we know that's not true. We know that we need savings in case of an emergency. We might have plans in the future we want to save for, like a business investment or a wedding, or we might want to buy a house. There are a lot of different reasons why we need to put money aside. But in the nonprofit world, we've been so underfunded that a lot of our conversations are about, can I just get my full paycheck once a month? Even if I spend it down to zero, I just need the full paycheck. Full cost is asking that we take a step beyond that and that we think about the entirety of our needs. Because the reality is we want to be a sector that doesn't spend all of its energy saying, I just need to get my full direct or overhead costs covered. We want to be a sector that can pay its bills on time. We want to be a sector that can respond to and adapt to changing community needs. And we want to be a sector that can adapt and thrive when a crisis or unexpected storm shows up. And so full cost takes this into account. And so that we think this is a better way to talk about costs in the nonprofit sector. Full cost names and claims all of the financial resources it takes to run an effective organization in the long haul. It lifts our sector out of the false dichotomy of program versus overhead. It captures both those short-term and those longer-term needs. And it's also holistic and grounded in context, right? We see this as a tool for advancing racial equity because it allows us to ground the conversation about costs in context. And that context includes present and historical practices of extracting wealth from Indigenous, Black, and other communities of color, often stealing that wealth violently to enrich white communities, right? So when we look at the cost composition of an organization and the community in which it's grounded, full cost takes into account that historical context of who has had resources and who hasn't, who has been enriched and who's been stolen from. It really allows for that nuance. And so now I'm going to dive into the 6 components that we see making up the full cost framework. And as you can see, we have this pie graphic here representing each of the 6 components. And as we're moving through each component, I want you to think of these not as equal slices, but as seats at a table, really voices in a conversation that are asking you to consider them when thinking about the full cost of your organization. And so we're going to dive into the first slice. And the first slice is total expenses. And these are both our operating and non-operating expenses. And so our operating expenses are our regular and recurring expenses that we expect month over month, year over year, like our utilities, including our light bill and internet, like our people costs, again, those recurring regular expenses. And then our non-operating expenses are more irregular in nature. They may be extraordinary one-time expenses that we don't expect to incur on an ongoing basis. This might look like a year where, God forbid, we get hit with a really big lawsuit and have a lot of legal fees to pay. If we don't get sued regularly, and that's probably the case for most of you watching this recording, we probably won't incur these kinds of legal fees again. And so again, both operating and non-operating expenses fall under total expenses. Direct and indirect expenses are also included here. Program and overhead expenses are included here, and depreciation is here. We also have something called unfunded expenses, which I'll talk more about in a moment. But what total expenses does not include are any purchases that are capitalized. And so if you're buying a building or purchasing an expensive piece of equipment, anything that's going to be put on the balance sheet, that purchase doesn't show up here. It's in another slice of full costs. And then also repaying debt principal doesn't show up here. That's also another slice of the full cost pie. But certainly the interest you pay would show up here. So to simplify this, you can think of total expenses as anything that shows up on your income statement or your profit and loss statement. But now let's dive deeper into unfunded expenses, because this is actually something that doesn't show up on any of our financial statements. And that's because these are expenses that are not currently being incurred, but that if we covered them, would allow our organizations to work at its current level, but in a way that is reasonable and fair. And so one example of an unfunded expense is sweat equity, probably one of the most common unfunded expenses, in fact. And this is where you have folks overworking and being underpaid. Let's say, for example, we have an executive director who's working 60 hours a week. Already, you're probably thinking that's a lot and unfair, but also maybe that's not uncommon. Maybe that's some of your experiences out in the audience watching this. Now, if that executive director were to reduce her hours to the standard 40 hours and hire an assistant to help out 20 hours a week, that would probably be a lot more workable. And so the cost for an assistant for 20 hours a week that the ED is currently spending in extra labor is an unfunded expense. And that's because if this expense were actually being incurred, it would allow the ED to work in a way that is reasonable and fair. Now, what unfunded expenses are not are expenses to expand or do more. So the example we just went over does not assume that if the assistant were hired, that the executive director would continue to work the 60 hours a week to push out even more, or that the ED would only take down her hours to 50 hours a week instead of 60. The idea is that this unfunded expense brings us to, again, a fair and reasonable place, equilibrium, if you will. And so sweat equity is just one example. Some other examples of unfunded expenses we see are subpar supplies, slow internet, and unfilled positions. Again, things that if we covered the expenses for would make our operations operate, our organizations operate a lot more successfully. In general, in the nonprofit world, we've gotten really used to dealing with less, and we've kind of accepted these gaps in our funding systems. And so we create these really creative runarounds and workarounds to make things work. We've stopped even asking the question, what do we really need to be doing our work in a fair and reasonable way? And the full cost framework asks us to reorient our thinking to consider what it is that we truly need. And so now I want to invite you to reflect, is this resonating with any of your experiences on the ground? Does your organization have any unfunded expenses that kind of keep you awake at night? And are you including all of your expenses in your budget? And then further than that, how do barriers to financial resources and capital show up for your organization? And can you articulate how these barriers are impeding your organization's effectiveness or ability to produce the impact your organization was created to make? And if these barriers could be mitigated or weakened, what could you really achieve? I invite you to reflect on that. And feel free to pause the recording and take a moment to even jot down some of your thoughts. Okay, now we're going to move along. So after total expenses, which we think of as existing on our income statement, except for, of course, unfunded expenses, which kind of just lives on our heart, we carry that with us every day. All of the other components of full cost, we think of being balance sheet needs. And so when we say nonprofits need profits, nonprofits need surpluses, these next 5 slices will show us why, because they only get covered by way of revenue exceeding expenses at the end of the year. And so next is working capital. And this is dollars to cover predictable ebbs and flows of cash coming in and cash coming out of your organization, even when they may not be aligned. Working capital really allows us to maintain business operations, even if money is late coming in or if bills must be paid early. This money is accessible to management, and it's usually held in a checking account. It is not restricted. It's not strictly designated either. Working capital is needed by all organizations all the time, but the amount varies by organization. It really just depends on what your particular cash flow situation is. So if you're an organization where the timing of dollars coming in and the timing of dollars coming out is very nicely aligned month after month, maybe 1 month of working capital is a very comfortable amount for you. Now, for other organizations, especially government-reliant organizations, cash flow may ebb for 6 months or even 12 months. And if you don't have access to 6 or 12 months of cash to continue operations while you're waiting on that money, you may not be able to make it through the year, right? And so it really just varies from organization to organization. What working capital is not are dollars to cover lost revenue, unplanned expenses, or deficits. These things fall under our next slice, which is reserves. And reserves are dollars used for a specific purpose, eventually replenished. Reserves are typically board designated, and some examples of designations are operating reserves, which is money intended to protect from risk by covering short-term deficits. So let's say you have a bad fundraising year, or a global pandemic hits. You want to be able to draw from your reserves to cover losses. Fixed asset reserve is another designation. And this is where you save for the repair or eventual replacement of your equipment, or for improvements to your property if you own any. And then we have a research and development reserve, an R&D reserve, which allows us to take artistic risks. And an investment reserve is another type that we might see. Usually there's a big pot of dollars that gets invested, and the intention is that this pot of dollars will generate revenue for the organization. So I want to caveat all of this by saying every type of organization does not need every type of reserve designation I just shared. Maybe for sure operating reserves. But we do believe that all organizations need reserves in general. Now, the purpose and the size of those reserves will vary by organization. For example, a fixed asset reserve may not make sense for an organization that doesn't own any property or equipment. And so again, it really just depends on each organization. Reserves should be accessible to management under certain conditions, usually with board approval that it is in fact time to dip into reserves. And reserves may be held in cash, savings accounts, or investments that can be liquidated in a reasonable time frame. And so sometimes folks ask us, what's the difference between working capital and reserves? Like, why are they two different slices of the pie? They're both cash on the balance sheet, right? And they're right, yes, they're both cash on the balance sheet, but they operate very differently. Working capital is meant to be accessed day to day, week to week, month to month. That balance is constantly going up and down and up and down. Reserves, however, are typically built up over time, usually years, as many of you out in the audience may know. And then a time or purpose comes to spend down those reserves, and that's usually a huge moment for an organization. I think COVID is a really good example of that for many organizations who saved for years and years, and then experienced a sudden loss of income and had to spend down reserves. And so generally with reserves, after you spend down, you stabilize again over time and begin to replenish again over the years, which is very different from working capital, which you're accessing more consistently. The next slice of our full cost pie is debt principal repayment, and that is dollars to pay off debt. It may sound obvious that if you borrow money, you have to make a plan to pay it back, but we name this as a piece of the full cost pie because paying back the principal balance on a loan is a balance sheet transaction. So again, when we say that nonprofits need profits, this is why debt principal is paid out of those surpluses. It is paid out of revenue being larger than expenses at the end of the year. And then the fifth slice of our full cost pie is fixed asset additions. And this is the purchase of new equipment, buildings, furniture, land, leaseholder improvements, etc. Fixed asset additions are not replacement or simple maintenance of existing fixed assets. We account for that in depreciation, which is under total expenses. We might save for the improvement of these assets in a fixed asset reserve, but this slice is particularly for the addition of fixed assets. This is also, of course, not for small equipment purchases that are not going to be capitalized, that are not going to be put on the balance sheet. And then we have the final slice of our pie, which is change capital. And change capital can be a transformative investment and a vehicle for advancing equity. So we're going to dive a little bit deeper into this concept. And so what exactly is change capital? Periodically, organizations must make significant shifts in their business model to align with changing community needs and other marketplace realities. And these shifts can include, but certainly are not limited to, improving programs and operations, investing in research and development, downsizing, or investing in new or under-resourced revenue streams, because maybe the revenue streams we have aren't working anymore and we need a refresh. In order to execute these kinds of business model changes, usually organizations require an investment that is implemented over a period of several years. And that investment is change capital. Typically, change capital is quite large, often double or even 3 times the size of an organization's annual operating budget. And when we think about how difficult it is to break even in our sector, given the flawed system we're operating within, we know that generating consistent surpluses is even harder. And so change capital is usually not a self-investment from organic growth, but rather an external capital infusion, an external investment from a trusted foundation partner or from an individual donor. Calculating the cost you need to change your business model is something you can work on with consultants like ourselves at NFF in greater detail to determine, what kinds of expenses will be incurred or even changed as a result of your proposed changes. And then what revenue will be needed to support those expense changes. The theory with change capital is that, these kinds of targeted investments will help generate year-over-year surpluses that eventually cover the full cost of doing business. 2 goals you want to consider when thinking through your proposed changes are, first, how to create a more resilient business model in the face of sector-wide changes. And then second, how to cover the upfront cost of change and deficits until your new business model revenue exceeds your expenses. If you think of your organization as being in kind of the startup phase again at the beginning of a change capital infusion, we know that often startups spend more money than they make in the beginning until their investments eventually produce a return that covers those startup costs and that is also sustainable and lucrative in the long run. And so now you understand the theory of what change capital is and what goals you should consider when shifting your business model. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about when change capital is helpful. And so just to orient you to this slide on the screen, we have time along the bottom and dollars along the left. We have expenses represented by the red line and our business model revenue represented by the green line. And like I mentioned a moment ago, what we typically see when an organization launches a new line of business or expands on an existing line of business is a need for an upfront investment like change capital. I mean, just imagine having all these brilliant ideas about how to change, but no funding to pursue these ideas for a long time. And then one day you get funding to invest in the change you want to see. And so where we start before that investment comes is at business as usual. And then we secure a change capital infusion to launch our business model change. Like a startup, our expenses exceed our revenue for a period of time until our revenue catches up or until our investment produces a return or a surplus. The time period of fully funding our new operations often takes between 3 to 5 years. Some of our new expenses will be one time, but many will be ongoing costs, such as new or increased staff salaries and maintenance of new tech systems. And so change capital will cover the deficits that we produce until our operations are fully funded by our ongoing revenue. And so our goal is to get here, right? To a place where our revenue outpaces the growth in expenses that we incurred from our business model change, so that we're generating year-over-year surpluses that cover the full cost of doing business. Before proceeding with more illustrative examples of how change capital is intended to support the reposition of your business model, we want to make sure that we distinguish between the 2 types of money your organization will need to balance during a change capital infusion. And these 2 types of money are buy dollars and bill dollars, which we can think of as ice cream. They're both delicious. We want them both. We need them both to make a great sundae, but they are 2 different flavors. Buy dollars are your reliable and repeatable revenue sources. These are dollars that we need every single year to cover our operating costs, including our services, our programs, and our overhead costs. Nonprofit organizations will always need buy dollars to operate from year to year. We need funders who say, hey, I want to fund XYZ mission. Your work is in service of that mission. Here's some funding to continue doing the work that you're already doing. And then we want them to come back the next year to do the same, and then the next year and the next year. These funders are regular buyers of our existing services. Emphasis on our existing services. We need them. Bill dollars, on the other hand, pay for extraordinary needs and are episodic in nature. Bill dollars are not intended to replace repeatable and reliable forms of revenue. Bill dollars can serve many purposes, but we most often see them used to invest in some sort of change for an organization and not in what they're already doing. And so that may mean investing in an organization doing more, doing less, or operating more efficiently. And because change capital is a temporary investment of billed dollars, once change capital funds are spent, the hope is that that buy revenue will be enough to cover costs and produce surpluses, which can then be saved and used to support the organization in the future. And so this graph is a visualization of how change capital is intended to support business model change. We have time along the horizontal axis, and we can see that it took this organization 5 years to fully implement their change. And then we have our ordinary revenue in purple and our change capital in yellow. And with this graph, organization A starts its journey with modest revenue and decides to hire a new development director with its change capital funds in hopes of bringing in new foundation revenue to expand its programming. By year 2, organization A is already seeing the return on its investment in the form of foundation dollars. However, in order to manage the inflow of grants, they must now update their accounting software, spending down more of its change capital dollars. In subsequent years, more revenue continues to come in because now the organization has figured out how to manage its grants program more efficiently, and they have their new development director bringing in ongoing funding. And so by year 2023, which is year 5 of their change, organization A has fully spent down their change capital funding and replaced it with ordinary revenue. By this process, organization A is able to sustain its new business model with funds it otherwise would not have been able to provide in the initial years without change capital. This is an example of a successful use of change capital. This is an example of what we might see when change capital is misapplied. So just to emphasize the point that has kind of been a through line throughout this section, change capital is meant to ensure that an organization emerges from a planned period of extraordinary investment more financially stable and resilient. It is not, however, intended to be a substitute for regular earned or contributed revenue. Remember that build versus buy distinction that we just went over? What we don't want to see is reliance on change capital as buy revenue, because change capital funds are eventually depleted, unlike buy revenue, which is under ideal circumstances ongoing. And so repeated reliance on change capital results in organizational shock when these funds are eventually depleted. And we sometimes call that the rubber band effect. And it's when an organization gets a capital infusion and grows to be 2 or 3 times its original size. And so it stretches and stretches and stretches. But when it can't sustain the growth because it didn't invest in those buy revenue streams, it's like you let the rubber band go and the organization contracts to its original size or smaller. And so what we're seeing on this graph where organization B applies change capital in a straight line manner over multiple years is considered misapplied. Because once the yellow funds on the graph are depleted, revenue may not be able to cover the costs associated with the new business model. And organization B will have to be bailed out. And so what we want to see, right, what we want to make sure that we're seeing is spending down of change capital in such a way that produces a return in the form of sustainable and repeatable ordinary revenue. That is a successful deployment of change capital funds. And we emphasize the distinction between buy dollars and build dollars so much because it's really important to know what kind of money you need as a nonprofit. And it's important for funders to know what kind of money they're giving and what rights they have based on the kind of money they give, which we'll talk about on the next slide. These kinds of dollars are not distinguished in financial statements in our sector. And so it's really important for us to know the difference. Lack of clarity about whether an organization needs or is receiving build or buy revenue creates confusion, unrealistic expectations, and frustration for both nonprofits and funders. So when a nonprofit can say, hey, this is the kind of money I need, and the funder knows the rights attached to that kind of money, that really sets the partnership up for greater success. And so let's go ahead and talk about what funders should be entitled to based on the kind of funding they're providing. If a funder is a buyer of the services an organization already produces, meaning they're not paying for change or transformation, they're entitled to budgets for the years they're funding only, standard reports that the organization is already producing for the years that they're funding. What we don't want to see is a funder asking a nonprofit for new reports that may require additional technology or additional staff labor that the funder is not paying for. The funder should only ask for data and evidence for program success that the organization is already collecting. Now, if a funder is a builder, meaning that they are funding an organization to build something new or transformative, their rights are different. However, they're still agreed to and negotiated with the nonprofit upfront. A buyer may ask for multi-year budgets and projections beyond the term of the grant. They may ask for strategic plans beyond the term of the grant. They may ask for cash flow projections, knowledge of other builders in their terms, and discussion about more than what the organization already does. And that is all fair. What we don't want to see is a buyer claiming builder rights. And I'm sure many of you listening have experienced a muddled partnership in this way, which is why it's so important to know the difference. And so now I invite you to reflect again. You can go ahead and pause the recording. Are certain pieces of the full cost framework speaking to your organization right now or to your work? What does your organization need to thrive? What has been your experience communicating with funders about full costs? Have you thought about what the right size is for your organization? And describe your ideal organizational structure. How does it differ from your current reality? And so now we've gone over the full cost pie in its entirety, and those 6 slices might seem like a lot. But as our time together comes to an end, I want to offer that not every slice of the pie is needed by all organizations all the time. If you remember what I said in the beginning, this framework is about these 6 slices being a voice at the table, asking to be considered. This is about us as a sector moving away from hand-to-mouth thinking. So even if you get to a place where you're starting to think about adding in your unfunded expenses, facility costs, et cetera, to your budget, that's a great place to be. And so I just want to quickly go over how we think about prioritizing full costs at NFF. Total expenses, working capital, and reserves, which are the top 3 slices, are needed by all organizations all the time. While the remaining 3 slices, debt repayment, fixed asset additions, and change capital, are needed by some organizations some of the time. Your organization may not have debt, or you may not own a building. And so these full cost considerations are on a case-by-case basis. And certainly your full cost needs might change over time. And because needs change over time, we wouldn't expect organizations to meet their full cost needs right away. What we do know is that financial strength in our sector is often built slowly over decades, but certainly funders can help speed that up by giving large and flexible grants, particularly to organizations working in communities that have been systemically denied the opportunity to build financial wealth. This is a final takeaway slide with some tips on transforming the conversation between nonprofits and funders to advance full costs. Some advice for nonprofits, be open to questions. They really help to build a deeper understanding of your organization. Have strong organizational strategy and communicate it clearly. Own your financial story and tell it with confidence. And also know that we are all on the same team in our desire to benefit and positively impact the community. And then we know that there is more than one player at the table. The burden is not entirely on nonprofits. So some advice for funders, create a safe space by listening and building trust. And remember that trust is built slowly over time. Avoid making assumptions. Be transparent about your strategy, your values, and internal processes. And again, know that we are all on the same team in our desire to benefit and positively impact the community. And with that, that is the end of our time together. Please visit our website for more full cost resources. Just as a reminder, we have our next webinar on partnerships and collaborations led by my lovely colleague, Kaya Scott, and we hope to see you there. Thank you so much for attending this webinar. I hope that you're all leaving here as full cost warriors. Take good care. Bye-bye now.